Hello everyone, I'm Dara and you are watching The Red Path. In today's video, we are going to be diving into the intricacies of the 10th edition World Leaders Army mechanic, the Blessings of Khorne. If you are eager to find the most optimal buffs to ensure that your World Leaders claim victory on the battlefield, then this video is for you. So grab yourselves a brew and let's dive in. Just before we start, a quick note. We're currently doing a community survey on the Red Path to gather feedback from all of you wonderful people about the kind of shows that you would like to see going forward in 2024. There's a link to the survey in the description down below and also in our Discord. So if you would like to have your voice heard and let us know what you think about what we have been doing and what you want to see from us, then check it out there. It doesn't take too long to fill out, but we appreciate all the responses. Anyway, let's get back into the meat and potatoes of this video. Since they're split from the main Chaos Space Marines Codex, the World Leaders have undergone two different army rule iterations. In the latter days of 9th edition, we had the much beloved Blood Tithe mechanic, which was replaced in 10th edition by the Blessings of Khorne. This semi-random mechanic involves rolling 8 dice, selecting 2 blessings from a list of 6 for the entire battle round. While the randomness isn't as impactful as people initially believed, strategic application of these buffs is very crucial to victory. In this video, I'll be dissecting each blessing, discussing their applications, and exploring specific tactics that have led to World Leaders' victories. Get ready for some competitive insights. Before we dive into the hardcore analysis, it's worth revisiting the buffs by themselves and deciding how useful they actually are on the battlefield. I'm going to divide all the buffs into 3 different categories, those which are frequently used, moderately used, and those which are more niche cases overall. The Blessings of Khorne roll happens at the beginning of the battle round, which is already a really interesting factor to be considered. The player going first has a large impact on which blessings you end up activating, and it has implications on the use of the stratagem to get a 3rd buff activated too. Importantly, the Blessings roll happens after your scout moves, so theoretically you could scout a unit with a banner of Khorne onto an objective before the battle round begins to net an extra blood dice reroll in the first turn, though personally I would only be doing this if that unit is also fulfilling a more important task. But after rolling your 8 dice, you'll then consult the blessings table and select 2 buffs as long as you meet the prerequisites for their activation. Blessings like Rage-Fueled Invigoration and Wrathful Devotion, which confer a +2 move and Feel No Pain respectively, will always be options for you since you can never fail to get at least 1 double on 8 dice. But blessings like Unbridled Bloodlust and Warp Blades can be a little bit more difficult, though even these are still likely to occur. Given this, let's talk about these blessings and rank them into those 3 groups I mentioned so that we can piece together a picture of their power and importance. Starting with Rage-Fueled Invigoration, which adds +2 to the move characteristic of all World Leader units. Without doubt, I would say this is easily one of the best blessings, and one which will be used very often. There is a variety of situations where this will be useful, including making charges shorter, reaching objectives, and maneuvering between cover. This blessing, coupled with Unbridled Bloodlust for advance and charge, are part of what makes the World Leaders one of the fastest combat-orientated armies in the game. I would put this blessing into the frequently used category. Moving on to another popular blessing, we have Wrathful Devotion, which confers a 6-up Feel No Pain across the entire army and boosting any existing Feel No Pain abilities up by 1. Given that there's already a few sources of Feel No Pain across the army, this ability is impressive. It makes Jackals and Exalted 8-bound quite tricky to move and gives a vital boost to units which lack staying power, like Berserkers. It makes specific damage types, like 2 damage into Berserkers or 3 damage into Exalted 8-bound, really inefficient. The World Leaders will often rely on at least 1 turn of being durable in order to really capitalize on the mid-game, or brace for impact if they've gone second, so I rate this blessing pretty highly. However, it's not one that you would have active throughout the entire game, often being the buff that I will select if I play for the Blood God stratagem. Therefore, I'm going to put it in the moderately used category. We then have Martial Excellence, giving the army sustained hits on a double 3+ roll. When it comes to your go turn, when you commit heavily into pushing the enemy back, Martial Excellence will often be the deciding factor, pushing through the enemy lines or breaking against them. Our army already has a plethora of high quality attacks in decent volume, so any opportunity to add more on top will ensure that the risky fights you take start to swing in your favour. As your forces may dwindle towards the end of the game, it can also provide a much needed boost in the dying moments of the game. This blessing also contests with warp blades, and I often see people debating over which is more efficient, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. For now, I would rank this as one of the moderately used blessings, since you'll often want it active in turns 3 through 5, but there are situations in which other blessings may be preferable. Total Carnage then activates on any triple or a double 4+ and confers an ability for models to fight on death on the roll of a 4+ when they are killed in combat. This blessing is quite niche, relying on a certain amount of foresight and anticipation about the turn ahead. Not only that, but the fact that the ability has a 50% activation rate also devalues its usefulness in my eyes. There are many situations in which it simply has no use, but against combat heavy armies it can be important for ensuring you trade more efficiently. I like it in these matchups as a reactionary play, especially if I've gone first, and I will often put it up with For the Blood God in these situations. However, outside of such matchups it won't often see play, so I'm relegating it to the niche case section. Warp Blades activates on a double 5 or any triple, conferring lethal hits on your army, which is sort of like the dark twin to Martial Excellence. Being harder to activate is actually interesting, considering the buff it provides is not necessarily more efficient than Martial Excellence. Into specific matchups such as Imperial or Chaos Knights or very high toughness armies, Warp Blades can be helpful, and again I will discuss situations in which it is more efficient to use it over Martial Excellence, but by and large these situations are the minority, and it will almost always be the case that it is not the correct blessing to use. Therefore I'm going to put this one in the niche case category as well. Finally, we have Unbridled Bloodlust, which on a double 6 or triple 4+ gives you army-wide advance and charge. There's not much to this other than outwardly being very powerful. Functionally, in many cases, think of this as adding an extra d6 to your charge rolls. Coupled with the stratagem for the auto 6-inch advance, it makes for a lethally fast combination, especially when paired alongside Rage Field Invigoration, meaning our army can turbo boost across the board like no other power armored faction in the game. This speed allows for incredible mobility and domination of the movement phase, meaning we can easily stage in runes and reposition ourselves when required. Realistically, you are going to have this or Rage Field Invigoration active in almost every single battle round, because at no point in the game will speed be unimportant. I'm going to give this one the frequently used stamp. This nicely rounds out the blessings into a fairly even distribution. It could be argued that Martial Excellence falls into the frequently used category, but that is a little bit list dependent, while the speed boot blessings are list agnostic and pretty much always amazing. That said, every blessing has its place and time to be used, so let's move on to their application in a typical Warhammer battle. So, the blessings that you are going to select in the first turn of a Warhammer battle largely depend on two things: how your opponent has deployed and who is going first. Depending on how much exposure your opponent has had playing against World Eaters and how good they are at the game, they will respect your first turn charge potential very differently. Inexperienced or unskilled players will allow for one or more of their units to be easily picked up by a first turn alpha, due mainly to bad deployment on their part. It's pretty easy to recognize this and capitalize on, so if you see an opportunity to go in pretty hard, it's probably worth going for. Naturally, in order to really jump on this, you'll also need the first turn, but if the stars align, go hell for leather, using blessing abilities to lean hard into dominating the game quickly. Throw up Rage Field Invigoration and Unbridled Bloodlust and shunt your entire army into theirs. More commonly though, against relatively decent players, you won't have such a plethora of options. But thanks to ubiquitous scout moves and blessing move boosters, you'll regularly be able to threaten one or two units, even if they are just screens on the first turn. In these cases, it can often be very useful to send a trade piece forward to lay down some early pressure. So it's not a bad idea to put up one of the movement based blessings and also Wrathful Devotion, so you can brace for the opponent's opening salvo too. You don't need to go all in on the movement if you're going to be trading a single unit in turn 1. Having a little move boost and then a boost in survivability at this stage means you're better positioned to hold against your opponent's turn 1 and capitalize on any mistakes they happen to make in the preceding turns. Finally, if you go second and anticipate a proper gunline pounding, you'll naturally want to throw up Devotion for some boosted protection. But you'll also probably want Rage Field Invigoration so you can boogie out of whatever bunkers you've set up in to weather their salvos. Most people don't realize that they'll actually still need the move boost even going second, so they can actually get out of cover quickly and start playing the mission or engaging screens. Often I'll see World Eater players stagnate heavily in their own deployment zones out of fear or lack of confidence. It's pretty rare that you will choose any of the combat based buffs in turn 1, but it can happen. For example, on Table Quarter's Search and Destroy deployment, you'll almost never need both Rage Field Invigoration and Unbridled Bloodlust, since the distance you are closing to the enemy is minimal. However, depending on what they've put forward, you may need a boost in killing power to get over the line, so it might not be a bad idea to consider something like Martial Excellence so you can push through with weight of dice. In these situations, it's also a good idea to consider sending a lesser unit of your own into the enemy lines, especially if they have screened with some trash units of their own. I always like to have a 5-man unit of Berserkers or some Jackals to hand for this situation, where I can scout them with Invocatus, give them Advance and Charge, and probably Martial Excellence or Warp Blades, meaning I'm not committing a valuable unit to clearing screens, but also ensuring that the job gets done by using either sustained or lethal hits. Here's a helpful tactic that I like to use when it comes to selecting the right blessings in the opening turn. Taking into consideration the situations I've just described, I'll often find myself engaging with 1 or 2 enemy units in the first turn, even if it's just an opening skirmish. If I don't have Wrathful Devotion up for the 6-up Feel No Pain, I'll always aim to have it active by the end of my turn through the use of For the Blood God. Many people will spend their first turn CP on the 6-inch advanced strat, but I actually rarely use this. Instead, I'll always measure what my charge distance will be before deciding if I will use the stratagem. Provided I have a relatively obtainable charge, I will generally skip on using it, instead saving the CP for the Blood God. This allows me to have either double speed or speed and a combat blessing up for my active turn, and then put my shields up with Wrathful Devotion as a preemptive block for my opponent's turn. Now that we've solved the opening blessings, let's dive into some mid-game buffs which you should be considering. This is typically where people will make the most mistakes, often not realizing which buffs are the most impactful at specific times, which can cause a game to be lost if they're played wrong. My personal opinion is that you almost always want to have either Unbridled Bloodlust or Rage Fueled Invigoration active. Games can be won or lost by a crucial charge failing or succeeding, and both of these buffs ensure that the outcome favors you, so I would advocate for them being active as much as possible. Ideally, you'd continuously have Unbridled Bloodlust up, but the higher dice rolls often contest with Angron respawning or combat based buffs, so it isn't always possible, and settling for Rage Field Invigoration is fine too. The reason I say this is that speed is one of the preeminent advantages that our army has over many others, so any time that you decide to sacrifice that advantage, you are taking a risk. The only time you don't want these blessings up is when you're being challenged by an equally brutal combat army, but we'll get to that in a bit since it's quite a different fish to fry. So if we take for granted that we will have one speed based blessing active most of the time, the question then becomes, what about the other one? The answer to this will vary depending on your opponent, and most of the time it will be either Martial Excellence or Warp Blades. But how do you choose between lethal and sustained? I've seen a lot of people say that they feel lethal is better than sustained or vice versa. Thankfully, we don't have to rely on gut instinct when a quick bit of maths will simply give us the answer. And I've done that math, so even you don't have to do that. The amount of attacks and whatever the hit roll is doesn't actually matter at all in this case. All you need to consider is how tough your opponent is to wound. When you're wounding your opponent on 2s and 3s, it's better to choose sustained. When it's 4s, both are equally useful, and when it's 5s and 6s, lethal is better. So that's nice and simple to remember. And while it may look like a nice even distribution, the reality of the situation is that, thanks to a plethora of high strength attacks in our army, most of the time you're wounding the enemies on 2s, 3s or 4s. So it's probably going to be better to use Martial Excellence to get sustained up for the army. In a given go turn, you need to be asking yourself, what is the most common dice roll to wound? And taking into account that you're probably using a lot of 8-band variants, Berserkers and Angron, you're probably wounding most things in the game on 3s and up. There are situations, such as Imperial Guard tank heavy armies or Knights of both varieties, where lethal from Warp Blades is more useful. But if we look at meta armies like Eldar, Votann, Necrons and Chaos Space Marines, you are going to be using Martial Excellence the majority of the time as your combat buff. Using a CP to put up Wrathful Devotion is as impactful here as it is in the first turn, especially if you've gone first in the game, since it will hold true for your opponent's hitback. Naturally, if you've gone second, a lot of the time you'll want to be putting up Devotion on the main Blessings roll, which can complicate the situation when it comes to the mid game. So look to activating either Martial Excellence or a Speed Booster if you manage to sneak a combat kill in your opponent's turn if they have the initiative. However, if you don't have this opportunity, here's a nice little tip to still get you over the line for damage output. Let's assume the opponent has gone first, and we're facing into turn 3 where things are starting to heat up. Rolling your blessings, you'll want Wrathful Devotion to get through their punishment, and let's also give ourselves Unbridled Bloodlust for the maneuverability. Hopefully, we'll get there without taking too much damage, and in our turn, we make a series of charges across the table, which will likely vary from being guaranteed kills to difficult combats. Always start with the combat most likely to succeed, and if this works, immediately use For the Blood God to get either lethals or sustained up for the rest of your army to ensure the remaining, more difficult combats are then more likely to succeed. You can apply this trick in a variety of other situations which are similar. For example, if your opponent happens to charge a Master of Executions at any point and he leverages his Fight First ability to kill the aggressing unit, you can put up something like Fight on Death to deal with the remainder of the charges across the board. This is why picking the order of fights can be really important, as it can suddenly shift the balance of combat back into your favour. So always look for these situations at the beginning of any combat phase. The endgame blessings are a little bit harder to define, since they can largely be dictated by the game state at that time, which will vary greatly depending on the success or failure of your game plan so far. Generally speaking, top World Leader players have been finding that in games of equally skilled opponents, they are normally finishing the game with very little models left on the table, even if they are securing the win. With that in mind, picking optimal blessings for the final turn is often what secures victory for World Leaders. Counting cards and assessing which tactical secondaries could come up in the final turn is highly informative for picking the right blessing. Will you have to make a desperate push to an objective far away? Look for speed blessings. Is there a kill-based secondary that requires the destruction of a tough target? Maybe lean into combat buffs if your charges will be easy. Will the battle hinge on flipping 1 or 2 objectives? Make sure you don't fail those charges and take Unbridled Bloodlust. Then cement your position with a 1 CP activation of Wrathful Devotion. It's easy to say these things now, but in the heat of the moment and dealing with the mental attrition that comes with endgame scenarios, you need to maintain concentration and focus on what blessings are going to get you over the line. Maximizing the usefulness of your last few units or models is very important to winning the game, and the blessings can confer abilities onto these stragglers which will push them over the line. But what about dealing with combat heavy armies? These are altogether more complicated matchups when it comes to the Blessings of Khorne, especially the mirror match. In these cases, the examples I just talked about become even more pivotal, so picking up on these advantageous moments can be key for flipping an entire combat phase around. Further, it's probably the only time that you want to seriously consider the Fight on Death blessing, since it will be very relevant in this match, and any time you remove agency from your opponent in this turn by killing their troops is really useful. It also allows you to trade more efficiently and get mileage out of your units, while also being forgiving if you make mistakes. It's especially prevalent when your opponent doesn't have Fight on Death also, since it makes your trading efficiency incredibly high relative to theirs. From the mid game onwards, if you have the first turn, I'll be looking for the Blood God stratagem to activate my Fight on Death towards the bottom of my turn, since it allows me to hit hard and move fast in my turn and then set up for my opponent's strike back. It's one of the few situations in which I would choose this over something like Wrathful Devotion for the survivability, since a few clutch 4+ rolls can really hemorrhage your opponent's assault. Combat matchups are also one of the situations in which you probably want to show a little bit of restraint with the movement-based blessings. Combat versus combat armies are like a chess game. If you make your play too early, it provides your opponent with a lot of information about your intention and may present weaknesses in your lines. I've always found that a cagey approach to this matchup is the best practice, meaning that most of the time I don't need the extra reach given by the movement buffs. This allows me to continuously have Wrathful Devotion up to boost my survivability, which can be pretty clutch for lure units trying to draw the enemy in, since it makes them harder to crack, and with a few clutch rolls it can cause them to stagnate, allowing you to jump on a sudden opportunity. More so than other matchups, you also need your units to be doing the jobs you've assigned them in the combat phase. A combat which stagnates for you can be disastrous, allowing devastating swingbacks from the opponent and slowing down your pushes. By relying less on the movement buffs, you can play with lethal or sustained hits to ensure that these situations don't arise. While combat armies are less common in the meta right now, interest in them is growing, and understanding how to play with your blessings in these matchups is really vital to overcoming the enemy. Many of the buffs which you would commonly use versus a shooting army are actually a lot less impactful versus a combat army, and vice versa. Hopefully though, this explanation shows you why this matchup is a little bit more complex. That pretty much wraps up this competitive deep dive into the blessing mechanic. As army rules go, it's a very involved mechanic, and it's a lot more complicated than the vast majority of other armies in 10th edition right now. There isn't really a one-size-fits-all application for the blessings, and their usefulness will vary depending on the stage of the game and your opponent's skill level and faction. I probably haven't even covered every possibility here, but I have tried to touch on what I think are the most important aspects of the blessings, while drawing from my own experience of playing the game. If you have other ideas though, experiences and suggestions, please do let us know in the comments down below, or hop into the Discord and jump into the competitive channel to share your advice. We would love to hear from you. If you have found the video useful or enjoyed the discussion, do drop it a like and a subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you want more from us or would like to support what we do, we have a variety of options which you can find down below, including Patreon and lots of other bits and pieces. We are currently conducting a community survey to see how we can improve and refine the content produced on the Red Path, so check that link down below if you'd like to have your voice heard. As always though, I hope you have enjoyed this installment of Competitive Insights. I've been Dara, and you have been watching the Red Path, so until the next video folks, stay healthy, stay safe, and kill, maim, burn.